I think every trauma surgeon's been personally affected by gun violence. I think we all carry with us a graveyard of kids that should be alive today because of firearm injuries. And that's really what we're trying to fight against.
When the American College of Physicians published a paper last year recommending stricter regulations on guns to reduce firearm-related injuries and deaths, the National Rifle Association shot back, telling anti-gun doctors to stay in their lane. Doctors turned the threat into an opportunity to educate through a hashtag. This is our lane. It allowed healthcare professionals to pull back the curtain on the blood-stained reality of treating victims of gun violence and show the devastating ripple effect on communities in the wake of those incidents. 1 year since the hashtag started, we spoke to some of the people who deal with this trauma firsthand to assess the viability of This Is Our Lane and to offer their prognosis on the movement.
So my relationship to firearms is primarily through my job as a trauma surgeon, especially here in South Chicago. A large number of my patients are victims of gun violence.
My older brother, Rashad Hassan Pratt, who was murdered during my training here at the University of Chicago back in 2012.
Especially since I've become a mother, telling a mother that her child is dead is just the absolute worst part about my job. I would give anything to never have to do that again.
I see everything through the prism of race, and the overwhelming majority of homicides in Chicago and across the country are African American men. About 60% of all gun homicides are African American men, when we only make up 13% of the population. So these racial disparities, they go across gun violence, and it's about poverty and economics and education. There is so much here to unpack that the reality is the least important part of my job is the job I do in the hospital. I need to get outside the walls of the hospital into the community and work with the community to do what we can to get to the root causes of gun violence.
The initial trauma is only the beginning of the whole traumatic experience. That oftentimes, if you do survive that trauma, the journey once you leave the hospital is just beginning, because there's a whole rash of different consequences that one may endure.
I think the big change that we've seen is a huge push, not only from the physician community, but from others as well, that and a bit of an acknowledgement that this is a public health issue. This has to be dealt with in a standard public health approach.
This Is Our Lane as a movement really galvanized the entire healthcare community, especially those of us that deal with gun violence on a day-to-day basis.
I think it's given us a bit of a common language that we all go through the same tragic experiences, and it gives us a sense of saying why this is so personal and why it is so important to us.
Within the last, year and 6 months, we've been pretty successful in really making these connections in our local community, local high schools, community organizations, where the moment that we start talking, they say, oh yeah, I heard about that. I heard about that Stop the Bleed initiative. Or I heard about, the Safe Schools Week. Let's try to do something around that. Or, listen, I did see something about that, and our school needs to be active shooter prepared. And so anything that we can do, you let us know. And so I think that makes it much easier, much more simple for a provider, a physician to really be able to engage in those works, because now that community is already aware. There's a little bit of community feeling like, okay, this is something that we can do to empower ourselves.
I want to see key stakeholders at the table having a good dialogue back and forth. I want to see people listening to both sides of it, or all sides of it, and say, I hear where you're coming from.
I do this because my goal is to actually put myself out of a job. It would be great if we can come to a time in this country where gun violence is not an issue and people like me are not needed.